September 1943. The Eastern Front near Smolensk. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter crouched in a hastily dug foxhole as Soviet infantry emerged from the tree line 300 meters away. His hands moved automatically to his Karabiner 98K, the bolt-action rifle that had served the Wehrmacht since before the war. 5 rounds in the magazine. 5 shots before he'd need to reload. 5 chances to stop what looked like an entire platoon advancing through the morning mist. Beside him, his squad leader, Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann, raised something different, a weapon Richter had never seen before. Curved magazine, compact frame, somewhere between a rifle and a submachine gun. Hoffmann didn't work the bolt. He simply aimed and squeezed the trigger. The weapon barked with a distinctive rhythm, not the methodical crack of rifle fire, not the frantic chatter of a machine gun. Something in between, controlled, deadly, precise. The advancing Soviet soldiers began falling, not in the wild spray pattern of submachine gun fire, but with the deliberate certainty of aimed shots. Hoffmann was firing at full automatic, yet hitting targets at ranges where submachine guns were useless. When his magazine emptied, he dropped it, slammed in another, and continued firing. No bolt to work, no frantic reloading of individual rounds, just smooth, continuous firepower. Richter watched in amazement as the Soviet advance faltered, then broke. The survivors retreated back into the trees, leaving their dead scattered across the field. Hoffmann had fired perhaps 60 rounds in total. Against a carabiner-armed soldier, those Soviets would have closed the distance. Against this new weapon, they never had a chance. "What is that?" Richter asked, staring at the weapon. Hoffmann smiled grimly. "The future of infantry combat. They're calling it the Maskinenpistole 43, but between you and me, this is what we should have had from the beginning. This is what wins wars." What neither soldier knew was that the weapon Hoffmann carried existed in defiance of direct orders from Adolf Hitler himself, that its development had been concealed under false designations and budget manipulations, that the German army had essentially lied to its supreme commander to create the weapon that would define infantry warfare for the next 80 years. This is the story of the Sturmgewehr 44, the assault rifle that emerged from bureaucratic deception, tactical necessity, and engineering brilliance. It's the story of how a weapon explicitly forbidden by the Führer became the blueprint for nearly every military rifle that followed. And it's the story of how German ingenuity created the future of warfare even as the Reich crumbled around them. The path to the STG-44 began not in 1943, but in 1918, in the mud and blood of the Western Front. German military theorists studying the last year of World War I had made a disturbing discovery. Analysis of infantry combat revealed that the vast majority of engagements occurred at ranges under 400 meters. Most firefights happened at under 200 meters. Yet the German army, like every major military, armed its infantry with full-power rifle cartridges designed for ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The standard 7.92 by 57 Mauser cartridge was a masterpiece of ballistic engineering. It could kill at extreme range, penetrate cover effectively, and maintained accuracy at distances where targets were barely visible. But it was also heavy. A soldier could carry perhaps 90 rounds comfortably. The recoil was substantial, making rapid fire difficult. And in the close quarters fighting that dominated the Western Front, that 1,000-meter capability was wasted. The German answer had been the MP-18, the world's first practical submachine gun. Chambered in 9 parabellum pistol ammunition, it provided devastating firepower at close range. But the pistol cartridge lost effectiveness beyond 75 meters. The MP-18 was perfect for trench clearing, useless for anything beyond. Between the wars, military theorists at the infantry school at Derberitz studied this problem obsessively. They had 2 types of weapons: rifles effective at long range but slow firing, and submachine guns with high rates of fire but limited range. What they needed was something that combined both capabilities. A weapon that could engage effectively at typical combat ranges with rapid fire, yet remained controllable enough for aimed shots. The theoretical solution was obvious. Create an intermediate cartridge, something more powerful than a pistol round, less powerful than a full rifle cartridge. A cartridge optimized for the ranges where soldiers actually fought, not the ranges where officers imagined they fought. In 1938, the Army Weapons Office quietly commissioned development of such a cartridge. The project was kept low profile. The Versailles Treaty had limited German military development for 2 decades. Now that those restrictions were lifted, the German military was pursuing dozens of weapons projects simultaneously. An experimental intermediate cartridge was just one more line item in an enormous budget. The specifications were precise. The cartridge must be effective to 400 meters. It must produce manageable recoil for automatic fire. It must be significantly lighter than the 7.92 by 57 Mauser, allowing soldiers to carry more ammunition. And it must be manufacturable with existing tooling and materials. Germany was preparing for war. Everything had to be producible in quantity. Poltwerk of Magdeburg took the contract. Their engineers started with the 7.92 by 57 case and began cutting it down. The resulting cartridge, designated 7.92 by 33 mKs short, was a revelation. It fired a slightly lighter bullet at lower velocity than the full-power cartridge. At ranges under 400 meters, the difference in effectiveness was negligible. Beyond 400 meters, it couldn't match the Mauser. But military statisticians had proven that such engagements were rare. The advantages were immediate. The cartridge weighed 40% less than the full-power round. A soldier could carry 220 rounds for the same weight as 90 rounds of standard ammunition. The reduced recoil made automatic fire controllable. The shorter cartridge allowed for more compact weapon designs, and manufacturing required less brass, less powder, and less time per round. By 1940, Polt had refined the cartridge to military standards. Now came the harder part, convincing the Wehrmacht to adopt it, and more importantly, convincing Adolf Hitler. The Führer had very specific ideas about infantry weapons. He believed in the superiority of aimed rifle fire delivered by disciplined soldiers. He viewed submachine guns as desperation weapons, suitable for police and re-echelon troops, but unsuitable for frontline infantry. The idea of replacing the venerable Mauser rifle with something that looked like a hybrid weapon struck him as defeatist thinking. In 1941, Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office, formally requested authorization to develop a rifle for the new intermediate cartridge. Hitler's response was unequivocal: denied. The Karabiner 98K was sufficient. Resources would not be wasted on unnecessary weapons development. Germany was winning the war. Why change what worked? But the Army Weapons Office had seen the reports from the Eastern Front. Soviet troops armed with PPSH-41 submachine guns were devastating German infantry in close combat. The Soviets advanced in mass, spraying automatic fire, overwhelming German soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles. Yes, the Mauser was more accurate at range, but in the forests and ruins of Russia, accuracy at 800 meters didn't matter. Volume of fire at 100 meters decided who lived and who died. The men at the Army Weapons Office made a decision that would have resulted in courts-martial if discovered. They would develop the weapon anyway. They would hide it in the budget. They would lie to Hitler. And they would bet everything that by the time the Führer discovered the deception, the weapon would have proven itself indispensable. The project was designated Maskenenkarabiner 1942, Machine Carbine 1942. The name was deliberately misleading. It sounded like a minor variation on existing weapons. In budget documents, it was listed under submachine gun development, a category that received less scrutiny than rifle programs. The funding was hidden across multiple line items. To anyone not looking carefully, it appeared to be routine weapons improvement work. 2 firms received development contracts: Henel, a respected weapons manufacturer in Suhl, and Walther, famous for their pistols and already producing the Juhier 43 semi-automatic rifle. Both companies understood the political sensitivity. This wasn't just weapons development. This was bureaucratic rebellion. If Hitler discovered the deception before the weapon proved itself, heads would roll, literally. Hugo Schmeisser, chief designer at Henel, approached the problem methodically. He had designed the MP-18 submachine gun in World War I. He understood automatic weapons intimately. The challenge was creating something that combined rifle accuracy with submachine gun firepower while remaining simple enough for mass production. The design that emerged from Henel was revolutionary. It used a long-stroke gas piston system, proven technology that Schmeisser borrowed from the Soviet SVT-40 rifle. The gas system was brutally simple. Gas tapped from the barrel drove a piston that cycled the action. No complex mechanisms, no delicate parts. It would function in mud, sand, snow, and ice. The receiver was stamped steel, not milled from solid blocks like the Mauser. This was critical. Germany was already straining its manufacturing capacity. The Karabiner 98K required 75 man-hours to produce. Schmeisser's design could be manufactured in 35 man-hours using stamped parts and welding. As the war progressed and Germany's situation deteriorated, this would become even more important. The weapon featured selective fire capability. A switch allowed the soldier to choose semi-automatic for precision shots or fully automatic for suppressive fire. This was the key innovation. One weapon that could perform both roles. No need to issue rifles and submachine guns separately. Every soldier would have both capabilities. The magazine held 30 rounds, a compromise between firepower and weight. It curved noticeably to accommodate the tapered 7.92 by 33 cartridge. The curve would become iconic, copied by virtually every assault rifle that followed. By spring 1942, Henel had working prototypes. Walther's design was also functional, though more complex and expensive to manufacture. Both weapons were tested extensively at the Kummersdorf proving grounds outside Berlin. The results exceeded expectations. Accuracy at 300 meters matched the Karabiner 98K in semi-automatic mode. Full automatic fire was controllable, with trained soldiers able to keep bursts on target at 150 meters. The weapon was reliable in extreme cold, tested to -40 degrees Celsius. It functioned after being submerged in mud and water. The stamped construction proved durable despite skepticism from traditionalists who believed only milled steel could withstand combat. Most impressively, soldiers took to it immediately. Wehrmacht personnel testing the prototypes consistently reported the same thing. This weapon felt right. It pointed naturally, absorbed recoil well, and the controls were intuitive. Experienced riflemen appreciated the accuracy. Submachine gunners appreciated the range. Everyone appreciated carrying 200 rounds instead of 60. The Army Weapons Office now faced their most delicate challenge. They had a working weapon that solved real tactical problems. They had manufactured prototypes in deliberate violation of Hitler's orders. Now they needed to deploy it to combat units for field testing without the Führer discovering the program existed. The solution was bureaucratic camouflage. The weapons would be issued to units on the Eastern Front, described in paperwork as new model submachine guns for evaluation. Officially, they were MP-43s, machine pistols. The name deliberately obscured what they actually were. To Hitler, already dismissive of submachine guns, they would appear as just another minor variation, not worth his attention. In late 1942, the first production batch of 50 weapons was shipped to the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler on the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The irony of hiding an unauthorized weapon program by sending it to the unit named after the man who had forbidden it was apparently lost on no one. The field reports began arriving within weeks. The SS troops were enthusiastic. The weapon performed flawlessly in the brutal conditions of the Russian winter. Soviet infantry attacks that would have pinned down Mauser-armed soldiers were broken by the concentrated fire of the MP-43. The intermediate cartridge proved entirely adequate for the ranges at which combat occurred. Soldiers were carrying more ammunition and engaging more targets. More units received the weapons throughout 1943. Each batch was accompanied by paperwork describing them as machine pistols, reinforcing the fiction. The Army Weapons Office was walking a tightrope. They were conducting a large-scale field trial of a weapons system that officially didn't exist, funded by money that officially went to other programs, in violation of explicit orders from the Supreme Commander. Then, in April 1943, something happened that would force the entire deception into the open. Hitler visited the headquarters of Army Group South to review the situation after the disaster at Stalingrad. During a briefing on equipment needs, an SS officer mentioned in passing how effective the new machine pistols were proving against Soviet infantry. Hitler, always interested in weapons, asked for details. The officer, unaware of the political minefield he was stepping into, enthusiastically described the MP-43's capabilities, how it bridged the gap between rifles and submachine guns, how soldiers could engage at rifle ranges with automatic fire, how the intermediate cartridge allowed carrying far more ammunition. The Führer's face darkened as he realized what he was hearing. This wasn't a submachine gun. This was the rifle development he had explicitly forbidden. His subordinates had deceived him, had continued a banned program, had spent resources he had allocated elsewhere. The explosion was spectacular. Hitler demanded to know who had authorized this program. He ordered all production stopped immediately. He wanted the weapons recalled from frontline units. Most ominously, he wanted names. Someone would be held accountable for this insubordination. The Army Weapons Office faced a crisis. Their gamble had failed. The weapon existed, soldiers loved it, but the Führer had discovered the deception before it had proven strategically indispensable. Careers were about to end, possibly lives. Then something unexpected happened. The frontline commanders intervened. General Heinz Guderian, the legendary panzer commander, had seen the MP-43 in action. He wrote directly to Hitler arguing for its continuation. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein added his voice. So did numerous division and corps commanders. All made the same argument. The weapon worked. Soldiers needed it. Whatever the political circumstances of its development, the tactical reality was undeniable. More importantly, the soldiers themselves began writing letters, not through official channels, but directly to the Führer through the various party organizations. They described how the MP-43 had saved their lives, how it had turned desperate defensive actions into victories, how it gave them confidence facing Soviet mass attacks. These letters, from ordinary soldiers Hitler claimed to champion, carried weight that officers' reports could not. Hitler was trapped by his own propaganda. He had always portrayed himself as the common soldier's advocate, the corporal from the trenches who understood the fighting man's needs better than the general's. Now those soldiers were telling him they needed this weapon. Refusing them would contradict his carefully constructed image. In July 1943, Hitler grudgingly authorized continued limited production of the MP-43, but he added conditions. The designation would change. It would no longer be called a machine pistol, which was clearly misleading. Instead, it would be the Maskenenkarabiner 43 machine carbine. The name still avoided calling it a rifle, preserving some of Hitler's ego. Production would remain limited. And the Army Weapons Office personnel responsible for the deception would face no punishment, but Hitler would remember their betrayal. It was a Pyrrhic victory for the Army Weapons Office. They had saved the program, but production remained constrained. Germany desperately needed the weapons, but Hitler's wounded pride limited how many could be manufactured. The war would not wait for his ego to heal. Throughout late 1943 and early 1944, the MKB-43 proved itself in every theater where it appeared. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers facing Soviet human wave attacks found the weapon transformational. Where a Mauser-armed squad might be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, an MKB-43 armed squad could generate enough firepower to break attacks before they closed. In Italy, fighting in rugged mountain terrain, the weapon's combination of long-range precision and close quarters firepower made it ideal. In Normandy after D-Day, German defenders armed with the MKB-43 inflicted disproportionate casualties on Allied infantry in the Bocage hedgerow country, where engagement ranges were measured in tens of meters. The weapon's reputation spread. Allied intelligence reports began noting a new German automatic weapon that was neither a rifle nor a submachine gun. Captured examples were studied intently. Soviet designers were particularly interested. They had been developing similar concepts and saw the German weapon as validation of their approach. German soldiers began calling it the Sturmgewehr, storm rifle, or assault rifle. The term came naturally. It captured what the weapon did. It enabled infantry to assault enemy positions with sustained firepower. The name spread through frontline units organically, from the bottom up, a soldier's term born from combat experience. In September 1944, something extraordinary happened. Hitler visited the Henel factory in Seoul. The German situation was desperate. The Soviets were approaching from the east, the Western Allies from the west. Germany needed every advantage. The Führer was briefed on weapons production, including the Sturmgewehr program. During the briefing, Hitler was shown the latest production figures. He was told how frontline commanders were requesting more weapons. He reviewed letters from soldiers praising the weapon. And perhaps most importantly, he was shown intelligence reports indicating the Soviets were developing their own intermediate cartridge weapons based on captured German examples. The man who had forbidden this weapon's development, who had exploded in rage when he discovered its existence, now saw it differently. The Sturmgewehr represented German technological superiority. It was proof that German engineering could still innovate. And in his increasingly desperate search for wonder weapons that would turn the tide, it was something real, something that actually worked. Hitler made a decision that vindicated everything the Army Weapons Office had gambled on. He ordered maximum production of the weapon. He personally gave it the designation Sturmgewehr 44, officially adopting the soldier's term. And in a piece of propaganda that would have been laughable if the situation weren't so desperate, he announced it as his own innovation, a revolutionary weapon he had personally championed. The men who had deceived him, who had hidden the program for 2 years, said nothing. The important thing was that production was finally authorized at scale. Whether Hitler believed his own revisionist history or was simply saving face didn't matter. The weapon could now be manufactured as fast as Germany's dying industrial base would allow. The SDG-44, as it was now officially designated, entered mass production in late 1944. The timing could not have been worse. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing. Allied bombing had destroyed factories, disrupted supply chains, and killed skilled workers. Raw materials were increasingly scarce. Transportation networks were cratering under constant air attack. Yet somehow, German factories produced over 400,000 SDG-44s between late 1944 and May 1945. This was achieved through brutal efficiency. The weapon's stamped steel construction meant it could be produced with minimal machining. Pressed steel parts could be manufactured quickly by relatively unskilled workers. Welding replaced complex fitting. Quality control was simplified. The weapons that emerged from factories in this period showed the strain. Early SDG-44s were well finished, with careful attention to detail. Late war examples were crude by comparison. Rough welds, minimal finishing, parts that barely met tolerance standards. But they worked. That was all that mattered. German soldiers didn't care if the finish was rough or the stock was cheap laminated wood instead of quality hardwood. They cared that it fired reliably and hit what it aimed at. The late war production also saw numerous variations and experiments. The SDG-44 with a curved barrel for shooting around corners, a bizarre but real device that actually saw limited use. Night vision scopes powered by primitive infrared systems, grenade launcher attachments, shortened versions for paratroopers and vehicle crews, dedicated marksman variants with telescopic sights. Most of these experiments went nowhere. Germany didn't have the resources or time for extensive variant development, but they showed how the basic platform could be adapted, lessons that would inform assault rifle development for decades after the war. The ammunition situation was more problematic. The 7.92 by 33 mm cartridge was only manufactured at a few facilities. As the war situation deteriorated, getting ammunition to frontline units became increasingly difficult. There were instances of units armed with SDG-44s but short of ammunition, forced to use them as single-shot rifles to conserve rounds or to scavenge ammunition from other units. This highlighted a weakness in the intermediate cartridge concept. It required a separate logistics chain. Soldiers couldn't share ammunition between standard rifles and the SDG-44. Units partially equipped with the new weapon had to maintain two different ammunition supplies. In Germany's collapsing logistics situation, this created problems. But when ammunition was available, the weapon's effectiveness was undeniable. Allied after-action reports from late 1944 and early 1945 consistently note German infantry armed with automatic weapons fighting far more effectively than their numbers suggested. Small German units armed with STG-44s held positions that should have required 3 times as many men. Private First Class Harold Thompson, a U.S. Army infantryman who fought in Germany in early 1945, was interviewed decades later about his experiences. His description of facing STG-44 armed German soldiers captured their tactical impact. We'd be advancing through a village or a forest, and suddenly all hell would break loose. Not the slow crack-crack-crack of rifle fire, not the wild spray of a machine gun, something in between. Aimed bursts that were dropping guys before we could find cover. It sounded different, felt different. The Germans could put out rifle volume fire from multiple positions simultaneously. We'd think we were facing a platoon and find out it was 6 guys with those automatic rifles. They hit hard, then displaced before we could bring up armor or artillery. Those weapons made every German soldier count for 2. British soldiers reported similar experiences. Captain James Morrison, commanding a rifle company in the assault on the Rhine, filed a report noting, "Enemy forces armed with the new automatic rifle are significantly more effective than those with standard weapons. A section of 4 enemy soldiers so armed can generate firepower equivalent to a full squad with bolt-action rifles. Their rate of fire combined with effective range makes assault across open ground extremely costly." Soviet forces faced the STG-44 in massive numbers during the final offensives into Germany. Soviet after-action reports praised their own submachine guns for close combat, but noted that German infantry armed with the Sturmgewehr could engage effectively at ranges where PPSH-41s were useless. The Red Army's response was to increase artillery support and armored vehicle participation in infantry assaults, tactics that worked but at high cost. The tactical doctrine that emerged around the STG-44 in its brief service life would influence infantry tactics for generations. German units issued the weapon developed what they called Stoßtrupp tactics, shock troop methods. Small squads armed with STG-44s would advance by fire and maneuver, one element providing covering fire while another bounded forward. The volume of fire from even a few weapons allowed for effective suppression of enemy positions. The weapon changed squad organization fundamentally. Previously, German squads were built around the MG-34 or MG-42 machine gun, with riflemen supporting the gun. STG-44 armed squads were more flexible. Every soldier could provide suppressive fire or engage point targets. The squad didn't lose effectiveness if the machine gunner was killed. This resilience made STG-44 armed units harder to destroy. Night combat, previously dominated by close-range submachine gun fights, changed character. The STG-44 could engage effectively at ranges where submachine guns were useless, but was more controllable in rapid fire than bolt-action rifles. German soldiers armed with STG-44s could engage targets at 100 meters in darkness with reasonable hit probability, something impossible with other weapon systems. The weapon also proved effective against light vehicles. The 7.92 by 33 mm cartridge couldn't penetrate armor, but it could damage vision blocks, destroy optical equipment, and injure exposed crew. There are multiple reports of STG-44 armed German infantry engaging Allied light reconnaissance vehicles and scout cars, forcing them to withdraw through sheer volume of fire. Perhaps most significantly, the STG-44 changed individual soldier confidence. Post-war interviews with German veterans consistently note this psychological impact. Soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles fighting enemies with semi-automatic or automatic weapons felt outgunned. Soldiers armed with STG-44s felt they had fighting chance even when outnumbered. This confidence translated into tactical aggressiveness that multiplied the weapon's effectiveness. By April 1945, the STG-44 was appearing in unexpected places. Volkssturm Home Guard units, typically armed with obsolete or captured weapons, sometimes received STG-44s. Hitler Youth formations were issued them. Even some Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine personnel defending ground positions received the weapons. Germany was throwing everything into the final defense. And the STG-44 was now available in sufficient numbers to arm units that would never have received new weapons earlier in the war. The irony was bitter. The weapon Hitler had forbidden in 1941 when Germany was winning was now being issued desperately in 1945 when Germany was dying. Had production begun earlier, had Hitler authorized the program instead of forcing it underground, hundreds of thousands more could have been manufactured. Whether this would have changed the war's outcome is questionable. Germany faced overwhelming material and manpower disadvantages by 1943. But it certainly would have made Allied victory more costly. As Germany collapsed, the STG-44 production facilities became targets. The Soviets were particularly interested in capturing the factories intact. They wanted the tooling, the designs, the engineers. Soviet designers had been working on intermediate cartridge weapons since 1943, influenced by captured STG-44s. They wanted everything Germany had learned. The Haenel factory in Seoul fell to American forces in April 1945, then was transferred to Soviet occupation as part of the post-war zone agreements. Soviet engineers descended on the facility, documenting everything. They interviewed Hugo Schmeisser and other designers extensively. They shipped complete production lines back to the Soviet Union, and they began their own development program that would produce the AK-47. The question of how much the STG-44 influenced the Kalashnikov has been debated for decades. Mikhail Kalashnikov always insisted his design was original, developed independently. Soviet archives released after the Cold War tell a more complex story. Yes, Kalashnikov was developing an intermediate cartridge weapon before seeing the STG-44, but captured German weapons clearly influenced the final design. The operating system is different, but the concept, the intermediate cartridge, the select fire capability, the curved magazine, all were validated by the German weapon. Hugo Schmeisser himself worked in Soviet weapons factories after the war. Whether he directly contributed to AK-47 development remains unclear. Soviet records are contradictory, but the timing is suggestive. Schmeisser was in the Soviet Union during the AK-47's development. He worked in facilities developing small arms, and the Soviets were not known for capturing enemy weapons designers and not exploiting their knowledge. Western forces also captured substantial numbers of STG-44s. American ordnance officers studied them intensively. The British were similarly interested. Both nations had their own automatic rifle programs underway, but the German weapon provided valuable data. It proved the intermediate cartridge concept worked. It demonstrated that stamped steel construction could produce reliable military weapons, and it showed that selective fire was practical and tactically valuable. The United States had the M1 Garand, a superb semi-automatic rifle, but American ordnance officers recognized its limitations. Full-power cartridge, limited magazine capacity, no automatic fire capability. The STG-44 pointed toward what the next generation of American rifles should be. This thinking would eventually produce the M14 and later the M16. The British had even more reason to study the STG-44. Their infantry still used bolt-action Lee Enfields. They were developing the M2, a bullpup rifle in an intermediate cartridge. The STG-44 validated their approach and provided hard combat data about what worked and what didn't. Post-war, tens of thousands of STG-44s remained in existence. Many were stored by Soviet and Western forces as war trophies or for study. Others were distributed to various nations' armed forces. Syria received STG-44s from Soviet stockpiles in the 1950s. Some were still being used in Middle Eastern conflicts into the 1980s. The weapon was so durable that examples produced in 1944 were still functional 40 years later. The 7.92 by 33 mm cartridge disappeared quickly. Without German production, ammunition became scarce. Nations using the STG-44 post-war either manufactured their own ammunition or rechambered the weapons for other cartridges. But the cartridge had served its purpose. It proved the intermediate concept. The Soviet 7.62 by 39 mm 43 cartridge was directly inspired by it. So was the American 5.56 by 45 mm cartridge developed in the 1950s. The technical specifications of the STG-44 seem modest by modern standards. Effective range of 400 meters, rate of fire of 500 to 600 rounds per minute on automatic, magazine capacity of 30 rounds, weight of about 5 kilograms loaded. These numbers don't seem revolutionary, but in 1943, no infantry weapon combined all these capabilities. The manufacturing techniques were equally significant. Stamped steel receivers were considered inferior to milled parts by traditional gun makers. The STG-44 proved they were wrong. Modern assault rifles from the AK-47 to the M16 use similar construction: stamping, welding, and minimal machining. The methods developed to mass-produce the STG-44 became industry standard. The ergonomics influenced every assault rifle that followed: pistol grip for better control in automatic fire, curved magazine to accommodate tapered cartridges, iron sights designed for quick target acquisition at combat ranges, select fire controls positioned for easy manipulation. Modern assault rifles differ in details, but the basic layout was established by the STG-44. Even the name endured. Sturmgewehr, assault rifle, became the international designation for this class of weapon. The American M16 is an assault rifle. The Soviet AK-47 is an assault rifle. The British SA-80, the French FAMAS, the German G-36, all assault rifles. The term Hitler approved in propaganda desperation became the standard designation worldwide. The weapon's tactical legacy is even more profound. Modern infantry tactics assume every soldier has an automatic rifle with effective range of 300 to 400 meters. Squad tactics emphasize fire and maneuver, with all members capable of providing suppressive fire. These concepts emerged from STG-44 employment in 1944 and 1945. Doctrinal questions the weapon raised remain relevant. Is it better to arm infantry with full-power rifles effective to 800 meters or intermediate-power rifles effective to 400 meters that allow carrying more ammunition? The STG-44 answered this question for most militaries. The intermediate cartridge approach became dominant. Only recently, with conflicts in Afghanistan where engagement ranges sometimes exceeded normal distances, has this consensus been questioned. The suppression versus precision debate also stems from the STG-44 experience. Is infantry firepower primarily about hitting specific targets or about forcing enemies to take cover? The STG-44's high volume of fire enabled suppression, allowing other elements to maneuver. This became standard doctrine. Modern infantry tactics emphasize fire superiority and suppression. The STG-44 proved these concepts worked. Individual weapon capability versus squad weapons mix is another enduring question. Should every soldier have identical capability, or should squads mix specialized weapons? The STG-44 enabled the former. Modern infantry typically issues the same basic rifle to all squad members, with specialized weapons like machine guns and grenade launchers added. This approach traces directly to STG-44 employment. The numbers tell their own story. Approximately 425,000 to 500,000 STG-44s were manufactured between 1943 and 1945. Exact figures remain disputed because German records from the war's final months were incomplete or destroyed. This compares to over 14 million Carabiner 98K rifles produced during the war. The STG-44 armed perhaps 3 to 5% of German infantry at its peak deployment, yet its tactical impact far exceeded these numbers. Allied intelligence estimates from early 1945 assessed that German infantry units equipped with STG-44s were roughly 30 to 50% more effective than those with standard weapons, adjusting for other factors. A German squad with 4 STG-44s and 4 Carabiner 98KS was rated equivalent to a full squad of 8 men with Mausers plus a light machine gun in terms of firepower. The cost was significant. Each STG-44 required 70 kilograms of steel, including materials for stamping, springs, and small parts. Ammunition consumption was higher. Soldiers with automatic weapons fired more rounds. Training time increased slightly, though the weapon's intuitive operation minimized this. But German commanders consistently reported these costs were worth the capability gained. The weapon's reliability record was exceptional considering its rushed development and the deteriorating conditions under which late-war examples were manufactured. Torture testing by Allied forces after the war found the SDG-44 functioned reliably through mud, sand, and water immersion. The long-stroke gas piston system was nearly foolproof. The stamped steel construction was durable despite concerns about welded components. Accuracy testing showed the weapon matched bolt-action rifle precision in semi-automatic mode at combat ranges. At 300 meters, trained soldiers could reliably hit man-sized targets. Beyond 400 meters, the intermediate cartridge's limitations appeared. But German doctrine emphasized that infantry engagements beyond 400 meters should be handled by machine guns and mortars anyway. The SDG-44 was optimized for the ranges where riflemen actually fought. The human stories behind the weapon reveal its impact most clearly. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Schneider, a squad leader in the 3rd Volksjäger Division, survived the war and was interviewed in 1983 about his experiences. He received an SDG-44 in October 1944 during the fighting in Holland. His account captures what the weapon meant to German soldiers in the war's final months. When they issued us the Sturmgewehr, I remember thinking it looked strange. Too short to be a rifle, too long to be a machine pistol. But the first time I fired it, I understood. We were defending a village against British infantry. They were advancing across open fields, probably 200 meters away. With my old carabiner, I could fire 5 shots, then reload. Maybe hit 2 or 3 men if I was accurate and they didn't take cover. With the Sturmgewehr, I could fire controlled bursts, 3, 4, 5 rounds per burst. I dropped the first man, adjusted, dropped the second. The British went to ground. I fired at their positions not to kill but to keep them pinned. My entire squad was doing the same, 8 men generating the firepower of a platoon. The British called in artillery rather than assault our position. That weapon saved our lives. Without it, they would have overrun us in the first attack. Schneider's experience was repeated thousands of times across multiple fronts in the war's final year. Small German units armed with SDG-44s held positions that should have been indefensible. The weapon didn't change Germany's strategic situation. No infantry weapon could have, but it gave individual soldiers and small units fighting capability that exceeded their numbers. The psychological impact on Allied soldiers was real and measurable. American intelligence reports from December 1944 noted increasing mentions in prisoner interrogations of German automatic rifles or machine rifles. Allied soldiers encountering SDG-44 armed opponents consistently overestimated enemy numbers. The volume of fire suggested more troops than were actually present. British Army operational research sections analyzed casualty patterns in infantry engagements late in the war. They found that German units identified as carrying the new automatic rifles inflicted 38% more casualties per engagement than those with standard weapons, while sustaining similar casualty rates themselves. The SDG-44 made its users more lethal without making them more vulnerable, the ideal outcome for an infantry weapon. Soviet forces, facing the largest concentrations of SDG-44 armed units, conducted their own analysis. Red Army intelligence bulletins from January 1945 instructed commanders to assume German infantry with automatic rifles required additional artillery and armor support to dislodge. Soviet infantry tactics emphasized mass and momentum. The SDG-44 disrupted these tactics by allowing smaller German units to generate defensive firepower that stopped attacks that should have succeeded through sheer numbers. The weapon's influence extended beyond its immediate tactical impact. It changed how military planners thought about infantry armament. Before the SDG-44, most militaries assumed infantry needed specialist weapons for different roles. Riflemen for precision fire, submachine gunners for close combat, machine gunners for suppressive fire. The SDG-44 demonstrated that a single weapon could fulfill multiple roles adequately, even if it didn't excel at any one specifically. This philosophical shift revolutionized infantry doctrine. If every soldier could engage at rifle ranges and deliver automatic fire, squad organization could be flattened. Tactical flexibility increased. The loss of any individual soldier was less catastrophic because every soldier had similar capability. Modern infantry squads organized around universal-issue assault rifles trace their lineage directly to this realization. The ammunition logistics revolution was equally significant. The intermediate cartridge allowed soldiers to carry twice as much ammunition for the same weight. This sounds like a simple improvement, but its implications were profound. Infantry units could sustain firefights longer before requiring resupply. Soldiers were less likely to run out of ammunition at critical moments. The psychological confidence of knowing you have 200 rounds instead of 90 affected decision-making at the lowest tactical level. German after-action reports from SDG-44 equipped units consistently noted reduced ammunition resupply requirements despite higher rates of fire. Soldiers fired more rounds per engagement, but the increased effectiveness meant engagements ended faster. The overall ammunition consumption was comparable to bolt-action armed units, but the tactical outcomes were superior. Weapon also democratized marksmanship. Effective fire from a bolt-action rifle required extensive training and practice. Soldiers needed to master trigger control, breathing, position, and rapid bolt manipulation. The SDG-44 in automatic mode was more forgiving. A mediocre rifleman could achieve acceptable results by firing short bursts. This didn't make training unnecessary, but it reduced the skill floor. Less experienced soldiers could contribute more effectively sooner. This had significant implications for Germany's deteriorating manpower situation. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was incorporating increasingly undertrained conscripts, many of them teenagers or men previously considered unfit for combat. These soldiers couldn't be turned into expert riflemen in the abbreviated training time available, but they could be taught to use an SDG-44 effectively in basic automatic fire. The weapon partially compensated for declining soldier quality. The Volkssturm, Germany's last-ditch home guard, illustrated this principle. These units consisted of men too old or too young for regular service, with minimal training. Armed with Carabiner 98 KS, they were marginally effective at best. Small numbers of SDG-44s distributed to Volkssturm units dramatically increased their combat capability. The weapons allowed untrained or poorly trained soldiers to generate meaningful firepower. This raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between weapons technology and military effectiveness. Does a technically superior weapon in the hands of inferior soldiers equal a standard weapon in the hands of superior soldiers? The SDG-44's combat record suggests the answer is complicated. The weapon definitely multiplied the effectiveness of poor soldiers, but it multiplied the effectiveness of good soldiers even more dramatically. Elite German units, like the Volkskammerjäger paratroopers and Waffen-SS formations that received SDG-44s, used them with devastating effect. These soldiers already had extensive combat experience and training. The SDG-44 gave them capabilities that made them extraordinarily dangerous. Allied forces learned to identify when they were facing SDG-44 armed elite units. The tactical signature was distinctive: high volumes of accurate fire, aggressive maneuver, effective combined arms coordination. The weapon's adaptability to different tactical situations was remarkable. In urban combat, short-range automatic fire was critical. The SDG-44 excelled. In open terrain, longer-range precision fire was necessary. The SDG-44's semi-automatic mode provided this. In defensive positions, sustained suppressive fire kept attackers at bay. In assaults, automatic fire supported fire and maneuver tactics. One weapon, multiple roles. No compromises severe enough to make it unsuitable for any common tactical situation. This versatility came at the cost of not being optimized for any specific role. A submachine gun was better for room clearing. A bolt-action rifle was better for long-range precision. A machine gun was better for sustained fire support. But the STG-44 was good enough at all these roles that a unit armed entirely with them could handle any tactical situation. This jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none approach proved more valuable in real combat than specialized optimization. Modern military thinking has largely accepted this conclusion. Contemporary assault rifles from all nations follow the STG-44 model. They're compromised weapons that sacrifice ultimate performance in specific roles for broad general capability. The American M4, Russian AK-74, German G-36, British SA-80 all embody this philosophy. The STG-44 validated an approach that has dominated infantry weapons design for 80 years. The technological innovations in the STG-44 extended beyond the obvious features. The weapon's gas system used a long-stroke piston that moved the full length of the bolt carrier. This system was less accurate than short-stroke or direct impingement systems, but far more reliable in adverse conditions. German designers prioritized reliability over theoretical accuracy because combat experience showed dirty weapons that fired were more valuable than pristine weapons that jammed. The stamped steel receiver was manufactured using deep-drawing techniques that minimized material waste. The Germans had perfected these methods, producing helmets and other equipment. Applying them to weapons manufacture was logical, but required overcoming traditional gunsmithing prejudices against stamped parts. The STG-44's success legitimized stamping for weapons manufacture. Modern rifles use similar techniques, though with more sophisticated dies and better steel. The trigger mechanism was deliberately simple. Two-stage trigger, select fire lever, and minimal parts count. This made the weapon easier to manufacture and more reliable. It also made field maintenance simpler. Soldiers could disassemble, clean, and reassemble the weapon without specialized tools or extensive training. The simplicity was elegant engineering, removing everything that wasn't necessary, keeping everything that was. The barrel manufacturing required careful attention to specifications. The 7.92 by 33 cartridge generated lower pressures than full-power rifle cartridges, allowing for slightly thinner barrel walls. This reduced weight and material consumption, but the barrel still needed adequate strength and proper rifling for accuracy. German manufacturers used cold hammer forging, a technique that produced superior barrels quickly and efficiently. The furniture, the wood or later laminate stock and handguards, was deliberately simple. No fine checkering, no elaborate finishing, just functional shapes that positioned the weapon correctly and protected the soldier's hands from hot metal. Late war examples used whatever wood was available, sometimes mismatched colors or grain patterns. This ugliness was a virtue. Weapons didn't need to be beautiful, they needed to work. The sights were rudimentary by modern standards. A simple post-front sight and notch rear sight adjustable for range. No tritium inserts, no optical sights as standard equipment, but the sights were durable and adequate for combat ranges. German soldiers trained with them could reliably engage targets to 300 meters. That was sufficient. More sophisticated sights would have increased cost and manufacturing time without proportional tactical benefit. The muzzle device was a simple cone that slightly reduced muzzle flash and protected the rifling crown from damage. It wasn't a flash suppressor or compensator in the modern sense, but it helped, and its simple design meant it could be stamped and welded like the rest of the weapon. Every component was designed for manufacturability first, performance second. This prioritization enabled mass production under increasingly desperate circumstances. The weapon's weight distribution was carefully considered. The magazine sat forward of the trigger, placing the ammunition weight close to the balance point. The gas system components were positioned to counterbalance the barrel weight. The result was a weapon that pointed naturally and didn't feel muzzle-heavy or butt-heavy. Soldiers could hold it on target without excessive effort, important in a weapon that might be carried all day and fired in short, intense engagements. The safety selector was positioned for right-handed operation, reflecting the right-hand bias of military equipment design at the time. Left-handed soldiers learned to adapt. The charging handle was on the left side of the receiver, allowing soldiers to charge the weapon while maintaining their grip with the right hand. These ergonomic details were carefully considered, showing that despite rushed development, the designers thought about how soldiers would actually use the weapon. The weapon's maintenance requirements were minimal: daily cleaning if fired, weekly inspection if not. The gas system needed periodic attention, but the long-stroke piston was accessible and simple to clean. Serious malfunctions requiring armorer attention were rare. German maintenance reports from units equipped with the STG-44 showed lower maintenance hours per weapon than for bolt-action rifles, despite the automatic mechanism. This was counterintuitive, but reflected robust design and soldier-proof simplicity. The ammunition itself deserves examination. The 7.92 by 33 mm cartridge was loaded with a 125-grain bullet, traveling approximately 2,200 feet per second. This was substantially slower than the 2,900 feet per second of the full-power 7.92 by 57 mm cartridge. But at combat ranges, the ballistic difference was negligible. The bullet still carried adequate energy to incapacitate targets at 400 meters. The cartridge case was straight-walled with slight taper, a compromise between manufacturing simplicity and reliable feeding. The primer was standard Burden type, requiring 2 flash holes. This was less convenient for reloading than American boxer primers, but simpler to manufacture. Every aspect of the cartridge was optimized for industrial production at scale. The powder charge was carefully formulated to produce consistent velocities without excessive pressure. German chemists had developed propellants that burned cleanly, reducing fouling. This was critical in an automatic weapon where fouling accumulation could cause malfunctions. The powder also had low flash and smoke characteristics, helping conceal the shooter's position. The bullet itself used a mild steel core with copper jacket, no fancy hollow points or exotic materials, just a simple full-metal jacket projectile that complied with Hague Convention restrictions on ammunition design. The Germans had experimented with specialized bullets, but for standard issue, simplicity and manufacturability took precedence. Ammunition production statistics were staggering. By late 1944, German factories were producing approximately 200 million rounds of 7.92 by 33 monthly. This required enormous quantities of brass, lead, steel, and powder. The logistics of distributing this ammunition to frontline units across multiple theaters was a challenge that was never fully solved. Units sometimes had weapons but insufficient ammunition. Other times, ammunition stockpiles existed but couldn't reach the troops who needed them. The Allied bombing campaign specifically targeted ammunition production. The factories manufacturing 7.92 by 33 mm cartridges were struck repeatedly. Production never ceased entirely, but it was disrupted enough that ammunition shortages became chronic by early 1945. Some STG-44 equipped units were forced to ration ammunition, defeating the purpose of having an automatic weapon. This highlighted a strategic vulnerability of adopting a new cartridge. The logistics chain was fragile and couldn't easily substitute. If 7.92 by 33 wasn't available, the weapons were useless. Mauser ammunition couldn't be used. Captured enemy ammunition didn't fit. The Wehrmacht was locked into a supply system that was breaking down. Post-war analysis suggested that Germany might have been better served developing a selective fire weapon in standard 7.92 by 57 Mauser. This would have avoided creating a separate logistics requirement, but testing showed that full-power cartridges in automatic fire were simply too difficult to control. The recoil and muzzle rise made rapid, accurate fire nearly impossible. The intermediate cartridge wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity for the concept to work. The Soviet Union learned this lesson. Their first automatic rifle attempts used the full-power 7.62 by 54 mm cartridge. The weapons were uncontrollable in automatic mode. Only after developing the intermediate 7.62 by 39 cartridge did they achieve success with the SKS and later the AK-47. The Germans had reached this conclusion earlier and paid the price in logistics complexity. The United States initially rejected the intermediate cartridge approach. American ordnance officers believed in the full-power .3006 and later 7.62 NATO cartridges. The M14 rifle, adopted in 1957, used the full-power round. Soldiers quickly discovered it was nearly uncontrollable in automatic fire. Only after Vietnam combat experience and adoption of the M16 in 5.56 Did the United States fully accept the intermediate cartridge concept the STG-44 had validated 20 years earlier? The British were more receptive. They developed the .280 British cartridge, intermediate in power, and built the M2 rifle around it. But NATO's standardization pressure forced adoption of the American 7.62 cartridge instead. The British eventually got their intermediate cartridge with the 5.56 SA-80, but decades later than they might have. The global small arms industry was transformed by the STG-44's validation of the assault rifle concept. Within 15 years of the war's end, most major military powers had adopted or were developing assault rifles. The Soviets had the AK-47, the Americans had the M14 and were developing the M16. The British had the SLR and were pursuing the M2 concept. The French developed the MAS-49. Even neutral nations like Switzerland and Sweden developed assault rifles. This rapid global adoption of a weapon concept that barely existed in 1940 represented one of the fastest technological shifts in military history. The STG-44 proved the concept worked. Every nation that studied captured examples or intelligence reports reached the same conclusion. This was the future of infantry armament. Traditional bolt-action rifles and full-power cartridges were obsolete. The assault rifle was the new standard. The influence extended to non-military applications. Police forces adopted assault rifle derivatives for tactical units. Civilian sporting versions were developed for target shooting and hunting. The basic design principles, intermediate cartridge, select fire or semi-automatic operation, detachable magazines, appeared in countless applications. The STG-44 was the progenitor of an entire class of weapons that now number in the hundreds of millions worldwide. The ethics of this legacy are complicated. The STG-44 made warfare more lethal. It allowed smaller numbers of soldiers to kill more effectively. It democratized combat effectiveness, enabling less trained soldiers to inflict significant casualties. Whether these developments were positive or negative depends on one's perspective on warfare itself. From a purely military effectiveness standpoint, the STG-44 represented progress. It gave soldiers better tools for the mission they were assigned. It increased survival probability for the users while decreasing it for their opponents. This is the eternal calculus of weapons development. Every advance in offensive capability can be framed as defensive, protecting friendly forces by increasing their effectiveness. From a humanitarian perspective, more effective killing tools are never positive. The STG-44 contributed to casualty totals in the war's final year. It made defending German positions more effective, potentially prolonging the war marginally. Each day the war continued meant more deaths. Whether the STG-44's influence on the war's duration was significant enough to materially affect casualty totals is debatable, but any contribution to prolonging the conflict was negative from a human cost perspective. The weapons development under deception raises its own ethical questions. The Army Weapons Office defied Hitler's orders because they believed the weapon was necessary. They were correct in their military assessment, but they were officers in a military serving a genocidal regime. Their deception enabled them to create a more effective weapon for that regime. That they were insubordinate to Hitler doesn't absolve them of serving him. This uncomfortable reality surrounds all technology development in Nazi Germany. The scientists and engineers were often genuinely brilliant and dedicated to their craft, but they worked for evil purposes. The STG-44 was used by Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units, some of which committed atrocities. The weapon didn't cause those atrocities, but it equipped the forces that committed them. Post-war, many STG-44 designers and engineers had successful careers in Western or Soviet arms industries. Hugo Schmeisser worked in Soviet factories, then returned to West Germany. Other designers found employment with American, British, or French firms. The Western powers were pragmatic. German weapons expertise was valuable. Moral questions about wartime service were overlooked in the interest of Cold War competition. This pattern repeated with other German technologies. Rocket scientists, jet engineers, chemical industry experts All were recruited by Allied powers despite Nazi affiliation. The SDG-44 designers were part of this broader Operation Paperclip-style acquisition of German technical expertise. Their contribution to weapons development continued for decades after the Reich's collapse. The SDG-44 itself continued appearing in conflicts long after World War II ended. East German Volkspolizei used them into the 1960s. Yugoslav forces had them. Various Middle Eastern nations received them from Soviet stocks. The weapons showed up in African conflicts, Asian insurgencies, and South American political violence. A weapon designed for the Wehrmacht was used in dozens of conflicts it was never intended for. Some units used them into the 1980s, nearly 40 years after manufacture. The durability that allowed SDG-44s to survive German winters in 1944 also allowed them to survive decades of storage and hard use. Weapons built quickly under desperate circumstances outlasted the regime that created them by generations. Today, functional SDG-44s are rare and valuable. Collectors prize them. Museums display them. Occasionally, one turns up in a conflict zone, pulled from some forgotten stockpile, but their military service is effectively over. Modern assault rifles long ago surpassed them in capability. The SDG-44 is a historical artifact now, significant for what it represented, not what it could do today. But its legacy lives on in every assault rifle carried by soldiers worldwide. The AK-47 family, with over 100 million produced, descends conceptually from the SDG-44. The M16 family, with millions produced, embodies the same principles. Every NATO soldier carrying a selective fire rifle in intermediate cartridge is using the concept the SDG-44 validated. The curved magazine silhouette, iconic to modern assault rifles, comes from the SDG-44. The layout, pistol grip, detachable magazine forward of the trigger, select fire mechanism, all standard features now, all pioneered or popularized by the German weapon. Even rifles that look nothing like the SDG-44 embody its design philosophy. The name itself, Sturmgewehr, assault rifle, became universal terminology. Nations tried alternative designations, automatic rifle, machine carbine, selective fire carbine, but assault rifle persisted. It captured what the weapon was, a rifle for assaulting enemy positions. The term's militaristic directness made it controversial in some civilian contexts, but militaries worldwide adopted it without hesitation. The tactical doctrines surrounding assault rifles, fire and maneuver, with every squad member capable of suppressive fire, came from SDG-44 employment. Modern infantry training in every advanced military teaches these principles. Squad tactics assumed universal automatic rifle capability. The organizational changes that followed, smaller squads with greater organic firepower, stemmed from the assault rifle's introduction. The ammunition developments trace back to the 7.92 by 33 Mkurs. The Soviet 7.62 by 39 was directly inspired by it. The American 5.56 by 45 represents further evolution of the intermediate cartridge concept. Even modern developments like polymer-cased ammunition and telescoped rounds are refinements of the same basic principle, optimized for typical combat ranges, not extreme ranges. The manufacturing techniques, stamped steel construction, welding instead of machining, minimal finishing, became industry standard. The AK-47's stamped receiver, the M16's aluminum lower receiver, all represent evolutions of the mass production approach the SDG-44 validated. Modern military rifles are built quickly and cheaply by industrial standards. The SDG-44 proved this was possible without sacrificing battlefield effectiveness. So when evaluating the SDG-44's significance, it's not about how many were made or how many enemy soldiers they killed. It's about how completely the weapon transformed infantry armament. In 1940, every major military used bolt-action rifles as primary infantry weapons. By 1970, every major military used assault rifles. That transformation happened in one generation, and it happened because the SDG-44 proved the concept worked. The German soldiers who laughed when they first saw the MP-43, who thought it looked like a compromised weapon that couldn't match a proper rifle, learned quickly. The Allied soldiers who faced it learned respect for what concentrated automatic fire at range could accomplish. The military planners who studied it understood they were seeing the future. And the soldiers who carry its descendants today, knowingly or not, benefit from lessons learned in the desperate final years of the Third Reich. The STG-44 was born from military necessity, bureaucratic deception, and engineering excellence. It was produced in chaos, distributed through a collapsing logistics system, and used by an army facing inevitable defeat. Yet it worked. It worked so well that it rendered obsolete infantry weapon systems that had dominated warfare for centuries. It worked so well that 80 years later, its fundamental concepts remain current. In the end, the STG-44's story is about how tactical innovation can emerge even from strategic disaster. Germany lost the war. The STG-44 couldn't prevent that, but the weapons solved a real military problem so effectively that friend and foe alike adopted its solution. The rifle that Hitler forbade became the rifle the world couldn't live without. When Hugo Schmeisser designed the weapon that became the STG-44, he was solving an immediate problem: how to give German infantry firepower advantages against numerically superior enemies. He couldn't have known he was designing the template for military rifles for the rest of the century, but that's exactly what he did. Every time a soldier anywhere in the world picks up an assault rifle, they're holding the legacy of a weapon developed in secrecy, produced in chaos, and used in desperation. The STG-44 changed warfare permanently, not through tactical genius or strategic brilliance, but through elegant engineering that solved fundamental problems of infantry combat. The weapon itself is history. The concept is immortal, and that, ultimately, is the measure of its significance.